Before I begin, I need to say something. What you're about to hear isn't easy for me. I never thought I'd share this with anyone. But there was a moment, lost in the mountains of northern Michigan, when I understood that some stories need to be told, even when it costs everything to relive them. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'm 43 years old. For the past 7 years, I've lived alone in a cabin I built with my own hands, deep in the Huron National Forest. People think I'm running from something, and maybe they're right. But what I found in those woods, what found me, changed everything I thought I knew about this world. I moved to the wilderness after my divorce, after losing my job at the automotive plant, after watching my life crumble like autumn leaves. The cabin sits on 12 acres I inherited from my grandfather, miles from the nearest road, accessible only by an old logging trail that becomes impassable in winter. Perfect for a man who wanted to disappear. The structure is simple: one room with a stone fireplace, a loft for sleeping, and a small root cellar. I generate power with solar panels and a small wind turbine. Water comes from a spring that runs year-round, even when everything else freezes solid. I hunt deer and rabbit, fish the nearby lake, grow vegetables in a small greenhouse I constructed from salvaged windows. Most people would call it primitive, but I found peace in the rhythm of survival. Dawn meant checking traps and chopping wood. Midday was for repairs and maintenance. Evening brought the luxury of reading by lamplight, listening to the forest settle into night sounds. I rarely spoke aloud, except to curse when I hit my thumb with a hammer or congratulate myself on a particularly good catch. Winter was hardest, but also most beautiful. Snow transformed the landscape into something alien and pure. The silence was absolute. No car engines, no neighbors arguing, no television chattering in the background. Just wind through pine boughs and the occasional crack of freezing wood. I learned to read the weather in cloud formations, to predict storms by the behavior of animals. My nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, an elderly woman named Martha, who checked on me once a month when the roads allowed. She'd bring mail and news from town, though neither interested me much anymore. The outside world felt increasingly irrelevant, like watching a movie about someone else's life. The footprints appeared on a Tuesday in February, during the worst cold snap I'd experienced. The temperature had dropped to 30 below zero for 3 consecutive nights. I'd been burning wood constantly, venturing outside only to replenish my supply from the shed. The air was so cold it burned my lungs, so dry it made my skin crack despite the wood stove's warmth. I discovered them while checking my rabbit snares that morning. The prints led from the tree line to within 20 feet of my cabin, then circled the structure before disappearing back into the woods. At first glance, they looked almost human, the right size and general shape. But something was wrong with the proportions. The prints were nearly 14 inches long and 6 inches wide, far larger than any human foot I'd ever seen. The toes were elongated and appeared to end in sharp points. What disturbed me most was the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these tracks was incredibly heavy, much heavier than a man my size. The snow was packed hard from the cold, yet these prints sank 4 inches deep. I followed them to the edge of my property, but they vanished at a rocky outcrop where the snow couldn't accumulate. The stride length was enormous, nearly 5 feet between prints when walking normally. In some places, the distance stretched to 8 or 9 feet, as if the creature had been running or leaping. That night, I loaded my grandfather's .30-06 rifle and kept it within arm's reach. I told myself the tracks belonged to a bear, though I'd never seen bear prints like these. Bears don't walk upright for extended distances, and their claws leave distinctive gouges. These prints showed no claw marks at all. Sleep came fitfully. Every sound outside made me tense, the settling of snow on the roof, wind rattling the windows, branches scraping against the cabin walls. Twice I thought I heard footsteps, but when I looked outside with my flashlight, I saw nothing but undisturbed snow reflecting the beam back at me. The second set of tracks appeared 3 days later. This time they approached from a different direction, emerging from the dense pine forest to the north. The creature had circled my cabin again, but these prints showed more deliberate behavior. It had stopped at my woodshed, leaving deep impressions where it apparently stood for some time. The tracks led to my greenhouse, where something had pressed against the glass, leaving strange smudge marks too high for any normal person to reach. Most unsettling were the prints by my spring. The creature had knelt beside the water source, leaving knee impressions in the snow. It had remained there long enough for the prints to freeze solid, creating perfect molds of joints and bone structure that looked disturbingly human-like, yet far too large. I began marking each appearance with a pencil notation in my journal. February 8th, February 11th, February 14th. The pattern seemed random at first, but after 2 weeks, I noticed the visits always occurred during the coldest nights. When temperatures dropped below 20, below zero, the creature appeared. On February 18th, I decided to wait and watch. I positioned myself in the loft with a clear view through the single window facing the forest. My rifle lay across my lap, loaded and ready. The thermometer outside read 26 below zero, cold enough to make the cabin's wooden frame crack and pop as it contracted. Around midnight, the wind died completely. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. I strained to hear anything. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of a small animal, but the forest held its breath. Then I saw movement at the tree line. At first, it was just a shadow among shadows, a darkness that seemed to shift independently of the wind-blown branches. I rubbed my eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on me. But the shadow moved again, separating itself from the background and stepping into the moonlit clearing around my cabin. What I saw defied every rational explanation I tried to construct. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, with a skeletal frame that seemed stretched beyond human proportions. Its limbs were incredibly long and thin, joints visible through what appeared to be pale, mottled skin. The torso was gaunt, ribs clearly defined beneath flesh that looked almost translucent in the moonlight, but it was the face that made my breath catch in my throat. Sunken eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's, but with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. A nose that was barely more than 2 dark holes in an elongated skull, and a mouth. The mouth was wrong in ways that made my mind recoil from processing what I was seeing. The creature moved with fluid grace despite its awkward proportions, each step deliberate and silent. It approached my cabin with the confidence of something that had made this journey many times before. When it stopped 20 feet from my door, it raised its head and looked directly at the window where I sat hidden. Those eyes found mine through the glass, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was aware of my presence. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. In that gaze, I sensed not menace, but curiosity. It tilted its head slightly, like a dog trying to understand a new sound. Then it did something that changed everything. It raised one impossibly long arm and waved, not a threatening gesture, but an unmistakable greeting. The movement was awkward, as if the creature was unfamiliar with human customs, but attempting to communicate in a way I might understand. When I didn't respond, it repeated the wave, more slowly this time. My hands shook as I raised my arm and returned the gesture. The creature stepped closer, moving with that same eerie silence. Now I could see details that made my scientific mind struggle to categorize what I was observing. Its skin was covered in sparse white hair that moved independently of any wind. Frost had formed on its extremities, as if its body temperature was barely above the surrounding air. It approached my greenhouse and peered through the glass at my struggling winter vegetables. Its breath fogged the panels, but when the fog cleared, I saw it had drawn something in the condensation with a finger. Even from my position in the loft, I could make out the crude image, a tree with roots extending deep into the earth. The creature looked back at my window, as if checking whether I had seen its artwork. Then it moved to my woodshed and did something extraordinary. It began stacking split logs with methodical precision, arranging them in a neat pyramid that would shed rain and snow more effectively than my haphazard pile. I watched in fascination as it worked, its movements becoming more confident as it focused on the task. There was intelligence in its actions, problem-solving ability that went far beyond animal instinct. When it finished with the wood, it moved to my spring and knelt beside the water, cupping its hands and drinking deeply. The creature remained by the water for nearly an hour, sometimes drinking, sometimes simply sitting in what appeared to be meditation. Occasionally, it would look up at the star-filled sky, its expression unreadable but somehow peaceful. When it finally stood and began walking back toward the forest, it paused at the edge of the clearing and looked once more at my window. This time I was ready. I pressed my hand against the glass and held it there until the creature raised its own hand in response. Then it melted back into the darkness between the trees, leaving me alone with racing thoughts and the impossible memory of what I had witnessed. The next morning, I found gifts. 3 perfectly symmetrical stones had been arranged on my doorstep in a triangle pattern. Each stone was smooth and dark, unlike anything I'd seen in the local geology. Beside them lay a cluster of pine cones, but these had been opened in a way I'd never observed. The scales spread wide like flowers, revealing the seeds within. Most remarkable was a bundle of branches twisted together into an intricate pattern. The weaving was too complex for animal creation, requiring planning and dexterity that spoke of intelligent design. When I examined it closely, I realized it formed a symbol, not unlike a dream catcher, but with geometric patterns that seemed to shift depending on the viewing angle. I brought the gifts inside and placed them on my table, studying them while my coffee grew cold. The stones felt warm to the touch, despite sitting in sub-zero temperatures. The pine cones released a fragrance unlike any I'd encountered, sweet and sharp simultaneously. The woven branches seemed to catch and reflect the lamplight in impossible ways. That evening, I decided to leave a gift of my own. I carved a simple wooden figure, a rough representation of a man, using my grandfather's whittling knife. It took me 3 hours to complete, my fingers stiff from the cold and the unfamiliar precision required. When finished, I placed it on the same spot where I'd found the stones. The creature returned 2 nights later, and this time I was watching from the beginning. It emerged from the forest just after 10 o'clock, moving with the same silent grace I'd observed before. But tonight, its behavior was different. It approached my cabin more directly, showing none of the cautious circling from previous visits. When it discovered my wooden figure, it picked up the carving with surprising gentleness and examined it in the moonlight. For several minutes, it turned the figure this way and that, running long fingers over the rough surfaces I'd shaped. Then it looked toward my window and nodded, a distinctly human gesture of approval that sent chills down my spine for reasons I couldn't articulate. The creature tucked my carving into what appeared to be a pouch or fold in its skin, then began a new task. It gathered snow in its hands and began shaping it with the same careful attention it had given my woodpile. Within an hour, it had constructed a perfect miniature replica of my cabin, complete with tiny windows and a chimney that even had smoke carved into its frozen surface. When the sculpture was complete, the creature stepped back and gestured toward it, clearly wanting me to observe its work. I pressed my face to the window and nodded enthusiastically, hoping to convey my appreciation across the barrier of glass and species. The creature's response was unmistakable joy. Its posture changed, becoming less rigid and more animated. It began moving around the snow sculpture, pointing out details and looking frequently toward my window for approval. When I applauded silently, it actually seemed to dance, a strange, graceful movement that was both alien and beautiful. This became our routine over the following weeks. Every few nights, when the temperature dropped sufficiently, the creature would visit. Each time it brought gifts, unusual stones, shaped ice formations, bundles of rare winter plants I'd never seen before. In return, I left carvings, drawings, and once a small metal harmonica that had belonged to my father. The creature was fascinated by the harmonica. It spent an entire visit learning to produce sounds from the instrument, its long fingers awkward at first, but gradually adapting to the mechanics. The music it created was unlike anything I'd heard, not melodies in any traditional sense, but haunting combinations of notes that seemed to echo the loneliness and beauty of the winter forest. Gradually, I began to understand that I was participating in something far more complex than simple gift exchange. The creature was teaching me, though the lessons were subtle and took time to comprehend. The stones it brought were arranged in patterns that corresponded to the positions of stars I could see from my window. The plants had medicinal properties I discovered through careful research in my small library of field guides. Most importantly, the creature was showing me how to truly observe the forest around me. It would arrive and immediately begin pointing out things I'd missed during my daily routines. Animal tracks I'd overlooked, trees showing signs of disease, weather patterns indicated by cloud formations and wind direction. Through its guidance, I learned to read the landscape as a complex, interconnected system, rather than a collection of individual elements. One night in March, as winter began its gradual retreat, the creature brought me the most remarkable gift yet. It arrived carrying something wrapped in what looked like woven grass, though no grass grew in the frozen landscape around my cabin. When it unwrapped the bundle, I saw a collection of carved bone pieces, each no larger than my thumb. The carving work was extraordinary. Intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories, though I couldn't interpret their meaning. The creature arranged the bone pieces on the snow in front of my cabin, creating a complex mandala pattern. Then it began to move the pieces, rearranging them in different configurations. Each arrangement seemed to represent something different. I could recognize patterns that suggested seasonal changes, weather systems, the cycles of animal behavior. I watched from my window as the creature used these bone pieces to create what appeared to be a comprehensive map of the natural world around us. It showed me where certain animals denned during winter, which trees would flower first in spring, where the safest paths lay through terrain that looked deceptively similar to my untrained eye. When the lesson was complete, the creature gathered all but one of the bone pieces and tucked them away. The remaining piece, a curved section carved with spiral patterns that seemed to move in the moonlight, it placed carefully on my doorstep. That bone carving became my most treasured possession, more valuable than my rifle, my tools, or any of the practical items that sustained my life. When I held it, I felt connected not just to the mysterious creature that had given it to me, but to the entire network of life that surrounded my small cabin. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, bringing with it a profound change in my relationship with the creature. As temperatures rose and snow began to melt, the visits became less frequent. The creature seemed to require the deep cold of winter for reasons I didn't understand. When it did appear, it seemed somehow diminished, less substantial than during the brutal months of February and March. On what would prove to be our final encounter, the creature arrived just after a late spring snowfall that dusted the emerging green with white. It moved differently than before, slower, with less of the fluid grace that had characterized its earlier visits. When it reached the clearing around my cabin, it sat heavily in the snow, as if the journey had exhausted it. I left the warmth of my cabin and stepped outside for the first time during one of its visits. The creature looked up as I approached, showing no fear or surprise at this change in our pattern. Up close, I could see details that had been hidden by distance and window glass. Its skin was not pale as I'd thought, but actually translucent, revealing a network of dark veins beneath. The sparse hair that covered its body was not hair at all, but something more like frost that formed and melted continuously. Most remarkably, its eyes were not the simple reflective surfaces they'd appeared to be from my window. They were complex, layered structures that seemed to contain depths like mountain lakes. Intelligence looked out at me from those depths, but also something else, a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. We sat together in the snow, two unlikely companions sharing the silence of the forest. Occasionally, the creature would point to something, a bird calling from the trees, a cloud formation overhead, the way sunlight filtered through the pine boughs. Each gesture was a small gift of attention, an invitation to notice beauty I might have missed. As the sun began to set, painting the snow orange and pink, the creature stood and moved to the edge of the clearing. It turned back to look at me one final time, and in that gaze I understood that this was goodbye. It raised one long arm in the familiar wave we'd shared so many times before, but this gesture carried weight of finality. I raised my own hand in response, tears freezing on my cheeks as I watched the most extraordinary being I'd ever encountered disappear into the forest for the last time. I never saw the creature again. Spring progressed into summer, then fall. Then winter returned with its familiar cold. I watched for signs of my strange friend during every cold snap, but the forest remained empty of its impossible presence. Only the gifts remained, the stones, the bone carving, the woven branches that somehow never decayed despite their organic nature. Over time, I began to understand what the creature had been teaching me through our silent communion. It had shown me how to live as part of the forest rather than as an intruder within it. My hunting became more selective and efficient, my gardening more attuned to natural cycles. My entire relationship with the environment around me shifted from exploitation to partnership. But more than practical knowledge, the creature had given me something I hadn't realized I'd lost during my years of isolation, a sense of wonder at the world's hidden depths. Every unusual sound in the forest made me pause and listen carefully. Every track in the snow received careful examination. Every change in weather became an opportunity to observe and learn. I found myself carving more frequently, creating figures not for trade, but for the simple joy of shaping wood into forms that pleased me. I began keeping detailed journals of my observations, recording weather patterns and animal behaviors with scientific precision. Most importantly, I started looking forward to each day rather than simply enduring them. The transformation wasn't instant or dramatic, but gradual and deep. Like a tree that bends slowly towards sunlight, I found myself changing in response to the creature's influence, becoming more patient, more observant, more connected to the rhythms of the natural world. Winter came again, and with it the deep cold that had originally brought the creature to my cabin. I prepared for its return with careful attention, cleaning my windows for better observation, organizing gifts to offer, even practicing simple gestures I thought it might understand. The coldest night of that second winter reached 38 degrees below zero, cold enough to make the air itself seem solid. I sat in my loft with my rifle across my lap, not for protection, but as a familiar comfort, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing came. I maintained my vigil through 3 more brutal cold snaps that winter, but the forest remained empty of anything more extraordinary than deer, rabbits, and the occasional fox. By spring, I had accepted that my strange companion was gone, perhaps returning to whatever realm had originally spawned it, perhaps simply moved on to other territories and other lonely humans in need of wonder. Years have passed since that last encounter, but the gifts remain unchanged by time. The stones still radiate warmth on cold mornings. The bone carving still seems to move with inner light when I hold it up to my lamp. The woven branches continue to catch and reflect illumination in ways that suggest they exist partially outside normal space. I've never tried to research what the creature might have been, never attempted to find rational explanations for its impossible anatomy or behavior. Some experiences resist analysis, demanding instead to be accepted as mysterious gifts that enrich our understanding of what's possible in this world. What I know with certainty is that those months of silent communion changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I see patterns in nature that previously escaped my notice. I find peace in solitude that once felt like punishment. Most importantly, I've learned that wonder doesn't require understanding. It only requires openness to possibilities beyond our current knowledge. Sometimes, during the deepest winter nights, I still hear sounds in the forest that might be footsteps. I continue to look, to hope, to remember what it felt like to exchange gifts with a being that should not have existed but somehow did. Martha still visits monthly when weather permits, bringing news from the outside world that interests me less with each passing season. She comments on how much calmer I seem, how the angry edge that characterized my first years in the forest has softened into something approaching contentment. I never tell her about the creature or the gifts that still occupy places of honor in my cabin. Some stories are too fragile to survive the telling, too precious to risk skeptical dismissal. Instead, I simply thank her for her concern and offer her coffee brewed from spring water that tastes somehow better than it should. My grandfather's rifle now hangs unused above the fireplace, no longer needed for protection against dangers I finally understand are mostly imaginary. The real world contains mysteries far more wonderful than any threats I originally feared. My true protection comes from the knowledge that I am not alone in this forest, even when I appear to be. The garden grows better each year as I learn to work with natural systems rather than against them. My hunting has become so efficient and respectful that the deer no longer flee when they see me, sometimes even grazing peacefully while I work nearby. The forest has accepted me as part of its community, a transformation I attribute directly to lessons learned from my impossible teacher. I write these words on a night when fresh snow covers the ground and the temperature has dropped to 25 below zero. Part of me still hopes for the familiar sight of elongated tracks circling my cabin, for the graceful shadow emerging from the tree line, for one more opportunity to share silent communion with a being that redefined my understanding of what's possible. But hope without attachment has become its own form of peace. Whether the creature returns or not, the gifts of our time together continue to unfold, every sunset observed with full attention, every track studied with curiosity, every moment of forest silence appreciated as a form of prayer. All of these are extensions of what that strange being taught me about truly seeing the world. The bone carving sits on my table as I write, its spiral patterns catching the lamplight in their endless dance. Sometimes I hold it and remember the weight of those impossible eyes watching me through my cabin window, the careful grace with which something so alien attempted human gestures of friendship. If someone were to ask me what I learned from my encounter with the impossible, I would struggle to put it into words. How do you explain the value of silence shared with a being that shouldn't exist? How do you describe the peace that comes from accepting mystery without demanding explanation? What I can say is this: we are not alone, even in our most isolated moments. The world contains depths we've barely begun to explore, intelligence that takes forms we don't recognize, beauty that exists beyond human categories of understanding. Sometimes, if we're patient enough and open enough and lucky enough, those hidden aspects of reality reveal themselves to us. The gifts we receive in such moments change us forever, not because they provide answers, but because they expand our capacity for wonder. They teach us that the universe is far stranger and more beautiful than our limited experience suggests, that mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be treasured. As I finish writing these words, the wind outside has died completely. creating the profound silence that originally brought my strange teacher to this clearing. I look up from my journal toward the window, hoping despite myself for a glimpse of impossible grace moving between the trees. The forest remains still, holding its secrets close. But somewhere in that darkness, I know, wonders continue to unfold for those with eyes to see them. The creature may be gone, but the world it revealed to me remains vivid and alive, full of mysteries that await discovery by anyone brave enough to watch and patient enough to see. I am changed. The forest is changed. Our brief communion created ripples that continue to spread outward, touching moments and seasons I have yet to experience. In learning to see through the creature's impossible eyes, I discovered that the ordinary world is far more extraordinary than I ever dared imagine, and that, perhaps, is the most valuable gift of all, the knowledge that magic is not separate from reality, but woven so deeply into the fabric of existence that we usually overlook it entirely. My strange teacher simply helped me learn to look more carefully, to see what was always there, waiting to be discovered. The wind begins again, a gentle whisper through pine boughs that sounds almost like a voice calling from the depths of winter. I listen carefully, as I've learned to do, hoping to hear in that wind some echo of the wisdom shared with me during those remarkable months when the impossible walked freely through my world. Tonight, as every night since our final parting, I fall asleep grateful for mysteries that resist explanation and gifts that continue giving long after their givers have vanished into the spaces between what we think we know and what actually exists in this strange, beautiful, impossible world. The snow continues to fall outside my cabin as I close this journal, each flake catching the last light from my dying fire. Tomorrow will bring new tracks to study, new patterns to decode, new opportunities to practice the patience my teacher showed me during those transformative winter months. I have learned that some encounters change us so completely that we spend the rest of our lives becoming worthy of what we experienced. The creature that visited my clearing taught me that wonder is not something we find, but something we become capable of receiving when we finally learn to see. In the years since our last meeting, I have discovered that the forest holds countless other mysteries. I found trees that grow in perfect spirals, stones that sing in the wind, and clearings where the snow falls upward on windless nights. Each discovery feels like a small gift from my absent teacher, a reminder that the world remains full of impossible things for those who learn to look with the right eyes. Martha visited last week and commented that I seem to have found whatever I came to these mountains seeking. I told her she was right, though I could never explain that what I found was not peace or solitude, but the capacity to recognize magic when it walks softly through my world on impossible feet, leaving tracks that lead not to explanations, but to ever deeper mysteries. The bone carving grows warm in my hand as I prepare for sleep. Outside, the wind carries sounds that might be footsteps, might be branches settling under snow, might be the forest itself, breathing in the deep rhythms my teacher helped me learn to hear. I no longer wait for the creature's return, because I understand now that it never truly left. Every careful observation, every moment of wonder, every act of patience and attention is a continuation of our conversation. The gifts we exchanged were not objects, but ways of seeing, and those gifts keep giving with each sunrise that finds me more awake to the world's hidden depths. Sleep comes easily now, accompanied by dreams of snow-covered clearings where impossible beings move with grace between the trees, teaching anyone willing to learn that this world contains far more magic than our small minds dare imagine. In those dreams, I'm always watching from my window, always ready to wave back when something wonderful acknowledges my presence in the vast, mysterious community of existence. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I hear the distant sound of a harmonica playing melodies that have no names, carried on wind that comes from places that exist only in the gaps between what we think we know and what actually is. The creature gave me more than gifts. It gave me a new way of being human in a world full of wonders we rarely pause to see. That transformation continues each day, a slow unfolding of attention and gratitude that has made my isolation not a retreat from life, but a deeper participation in its endless mystery. This is my testimony, written by lamplight in a cabin where the impossible once left footprints in the snow. May whoever reads these words find their own tracks to follow, their own mysteries to cherish, their own impossible teachers waiting patiently in the spaces where wonder still walks freely through our world. The fire dies to embers. The journal closes. Outside, fresh snow covers old tracks, preparing the forest for new stories yet to be discovered by anyone brave enough to look beyond what they think they already know about this strange, beautiful, endlessly surprising world we call home.